Let's break down three wide receivers and three running backs that are sneaky starts heading into week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. These are players that may be sitting on your bench. They may be out there on the waiver wire, but they have some sneaky upside moving into the first round of the fantasy playoffs. All right, let's kick the video off with Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, who I don't know if he's really sneaky at this point. It feels like a lot of fantasy managers are mentioning Adam Thielen, getting a lot of questions about Thielen going into the week. But Adam Thielen is one of these players that more than likely you picked up off the waiver wire or you drafted him late, maybe got him off the waiver early. He was sitting on IR for most of the year for you. Nonetheless, you probably have other players, whether it's a flex spot, running backs, wide receivers, or wide receivers in general, who you've been playing in front of Adam Thielen maybe outside of the past 2 weeks or so, right? So he is a player sitting at 74% rostered, also probably not out there on the waiver anymore, but check, if he is out there, he's a great pickup. And yes, overall, he's a fantastic play this week. He has 10 or more targets in his last 2 games, 11 targets against the Eagles in what has basically been a defense that has had a shutdown secondary the past few weeks, 9 catches, 102 receiving yards, and 19.2 fantasy points. A great game in that big performance in week 13 against a bad Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary, where he should have had even more fantasy points as one of his touchdowns ended up not counting, and it should have, right? This week he gets the Dallas Cowboys, who just got torched by Jamar Chase and the Cincinnati Bengals. And listen, Adam Thielen is no Jamar Chase, right? But nonetheless, this secondary is still giving up a ton of fantasy points. 2 wide receivers in the bottom 10 against the position, overall giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Thielen is in a fantastic spot going into week 15. If you have one of your stud wide receivers or a player that you've been starting throughout the season who's kind of bringing you a low ceiling, not a great floor, whatever it is, an injured player, whatever it may be, and you have Adam Thielen on your roster, do not be afraid to start Adam Thielen whatsoever. He is a nice start going into the week, and he definitely is a sneaky start going into week 15. And Adam Thielen is a player whose underdog lines this week are incredible. His total reception line is sitting at 4.5 receptions. His receiving yards are sitting at 50.5 total receiving yards. He's basically doubled both of those in his last 2 games and now has a great matchup against the Cowboys at home this week. I'm heading straight to Underdog to take the over on either of Adam Thielen's receiving yards or his receptions going into week 15. If you guys don't already know, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code catch a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 15's action. You can take that free Pick'em, pair it with Adam Thielen's total receptions or receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch on Underdog, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 15 and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up using promo code TheCatch. All right, next up, I want to take a look at Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. Now, obviously, Tillman is a player who is still technically dealing with a concussion in concussion protocol, questionable going into the week, but he has not played in 2 weeks, right? So there is a chance that he's good to go this week against the Chiefs. Player that's dropped down to 48% rostered, and a player in an offense that we know is going to throw the football a ton with Jameis Winston at quarterback. But obviously we got to pay attention. Like, is Tillman even going to play this week? But the other thing kind of going on here is that David Njoku is going into the week as questionable, and I've read some reports that Njoku has a very strong chance of not playing this week due to a hamstring injury that he is dealing with. And Njoku has 9 or more targets in his 3 of his last 4 games, 13 or more targets in his last 2 games and 3 touchdowns. So that's going to open up a ton of targets as well as plenty of red zone opportunities for these Browns wide receivers in a competitive game script. So if Tillman plays, I think he's a flex option. I think he has a little bit of risk because he hasn't played in 2 weeks, and in his last full game, he only had 7.7 fantasy points. But the 3 games before that, as I'm sure you guys remember, he had 18.1 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, a ceiling of 28.9 fantasy points, and 3 touchdowns. So if Tillman's out there and available and he is cleared for this week, I know the matchup you might think is a little bit tough, but this Chiefs secondary has not been as good as of late, and they're a bit banged up. The Browns are at home. We know Jameis Winston's going to throw the football. He has thrown the football 41 or more times every game since week 8, except for the snow game in week 12 against Pittsburgh. So everything's kind of lining up here for Tillman to return. Maybe not have one of these massive games that we saw in that 3-game stretch between week 7 and week 9, but can definitely come out and provide a safe floor. I still think Judy's a wide receiver 1 here. I still think Elijah Moore will get involved, but those open targets, because of Njoku probably missing the week, and potential red zone targets are strongly going to help Cedric Tillman. And don't forget, the Browns play the Bengals in week 16, so Tillman could be a good add overall, sitting at 48% rostered. Tough matchup in week 17 against Miami, but nonetheless, if you need a player in week 15, Cedric Tillman could have a lot of sneaky upside if he is cleared from concussion protocol. All right, last wide receiver I'm going to mention is Amari Cooper of the Buffalo Bills, who you might be saying it's not a sneaky star. It's Amari Cooper. Well, I mean, Cooper's been pretty much awful since week 8 outside of this past week where he showed up again, right? 15.5 fantasy points in week 14, 14 targets, 6 grabs, 95 receiving yards in that high-scoring game against the Rams, right? Before that, 7.5 or less points in every game he played in since week 8. And really, since being traded to the Bills, he had that nice first game against Tennessee where he had 4 catches and a touchdown, 16.6 fantasy points. But outside of this past week, like I said, he's done absolutely nothing. He's been incredibly sporadic. He had the wrist injury, all this stuff, right? But here in week 15, we've got another great matchup on paper, another great game script on paper between 2 of the best teams in the NFL, between the Lions and the Bills. And the Lions, the weakest part of this defense all season long, has been the secondary, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Cooper could be in line for another big game. I still think Shakir is the safest wide receiver to start on this team, and we do have Keon Coleman potentially making his return from his wrist injury this week, which could impact things. But we've also got Dalton Kincaid potentially coming back, which I guess could impact things, but he hasn't had more than 7 targets in but 1 game on the season. He just hasn't had that same impact as his past year. But nonetheless, I'm not going to overthink all these things. Cooper's coming off of a strong game where he led this team in targets with 14 total targets, and it's a great matchup. I expect a good game script. I don't know if it's going to be as high scoring as last week's game against the Rams, but it should be a high scoring game, right? And nonetheless, it's going to be a very competitive game. It's going to be probably the best game of the entire week, and I think Cooper will be heavily involved. So if you're kind of questioning your flex area, looking at your bench options, you end up in a tough position at the end of the week due to injuries, something like that. Amari Cooper could definitely walk in here and be a very sneaky start. A lot of upside in week 15. Let's move along to the running back position, and I want to talk about Braelon Allen of the New York Jets, and I want to talk a little bit about Isaiah Davis of the New York Jets as well, and I guess we're going to talk about Breece Hall of the Jets as well. Listen, it is Thursday. Breece Hall has not practiced this week, okay? I've said it all week long. I don't think Breece Hall is going to play this weekend, okay? I think if you're a Breece Hall owner, we're getting closer and closer to seeing Breece Hall just shut down for the season, regardless of what the Jets are saying and telling us. This is just what I feel. And I mean, the Jets are playing for nothing. They're out of playoff contention. They're playing the Jags this week. I could be wrong, but I really think if you own Braelon Allen or Isaiah Davis, that you could be in another week where we see both of these running backs score double-digit fantasy points like we saw this past week. Now, the Jags defense, surprisingly, has actually been a little bit better over the past weeks, especially against the pass. But this is still one of the worst teams in the league against opposing running backs, giving up the 31st most fantasy points to the running back position. So we got to keep that in mind. And I would even argue, if Breece Hall is active and plays, we might still see a lot of touches to Braelon Allen and Isaiah Davis. And I could easily still see these running backs having fantasy value this week due to the matchup, right? So I just don't know if I believe this whole, Breece Hall is going to play this week. And I mean, right now, the trend is pointing towards that he's not going to play. Like I said, he has not practiced this week. He's been actively rehabbing his knee. So there's a chance, don't get me wrong. I mean, I could be completely wrong on this, but I think if you own Braelon Allen and Isaiah Davis, who both have like really low projections going into the week, that there is a strong chance that these are the two running backs that we see starting for the Jets this week. And due to the matchup here, they could come through with another double-digit performance out of both these guys. Davis, 15.7 fantasy points this past week. Allen, 12.1 this past week. I will not be shocked if they come out here and do that again against the Jags in Week 15. Next up, let's talk about Sincere McCormick of the Las Vegas Raiders, your true league winner here in the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. We'll find out, but that is basically what some people are crowning him. Now, I do think McCormick is really interesting this week because we do have Alexander Mattison practicing in full. Zamir White has headed to IR, so we at least know he's out of the picture. And we did fortunately see Amir Abdullah take a complete step back in Week 14. He had just 2 total touches, 1 catch, 1 rushing attempt, So it was all Sincere McCormick against Tampa Bay. 15 touches on the ground, 78 yards, 5.2 yards per carry, 3 targets, 2 catches, 11 receiving yards, 10.9 fantasy points. And the Raiders have essentially come out and said that McCormick is the lead back for the Raiders moving forward. But I think we'll still see some sprinkles of Alexander Mattison, who has practiced in full at least once on the week. So I guess that kind of hurts the stock of Sincere McCormick, but ultimately the coaching staff is trusting Sincere McCormick, and I think they want to see what they have in a young running back as opposed to Alexander Mattison, right? A veteran running back. So I think McCormick's going to get the bulk of the touches once again. It's still a tough matchup here against the Atlanta Falcons, giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to running backs, but McCormick's still sitting at just 41% rostered and is probably going to go into Week 15 as a lead running back. Can always score, is going to get the bulk of the touches. Maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling because of the offense he's in, right? But ultimately, I still think that McCormick could come through and give you double-digit fantasy points and have some upside this week. And Week 16, he gets the Jaguars. Week 17, he gets the Saints. 2 bottom 5 run defenses when it comes to fantasy football. So McCormick's out there and available. I think it's a sneaky start this week. He might just be a sneaky start the rest of the fantasy season. And last but not least, I want to talk about Chris Rodriguez of the Washington Commanders. This is an interesting one. He sits at 10% rostered. I think there's a lot of risk associated here. So, tread lightly with this one. But I want to look back to Week 13 when the Tennessee Titans were getting absolutely blown out by the Washington Commanders. Brian Robinson had 17.9 fantasy points, 103 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 1 catch. Chris Rodriguez had 13 touches, 94 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 7.2 yards per carry, 15.4 fantasy points. Bye week last week. And now in Week 15, the Commanders will travel to face the Saints, who have a backup quarterback, MVS, who's been okay at wide receiver. That's it. No Taysom Hill. Alvin Kamara is questionable going into the week. He'll probably be fine, right? but injuries left and right on this offense, and a defense allowing a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers and running backs. This is another match that is made for the Commanders to come out and blow out the Saints and put up a lot of points. And they're at that point in the season. They got a big game in Week 16 against Philly. They got to try and preserve a running back like Brian Robinson Jr., who has had some injuries throughout the season, and Austin Eckler's currently sitting on IR. So Chris Rodriguez was the next man up in Week 13. Jeremy McNichols only had 6 touches in that game. I mean, I guess there's a chance that McNichols ends up being the second RB to get the touches here in Week 15, but I would theorize by what we saw in Week 13, it would be Chris Rodriguez. So if you are absolutely desperate, if you're in a deeper format, Saints are giving up the 28th most points to running backs. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that the Commanders will utilize a second running back in this matchup, especially if they get up early on the Saints. And I mean, we've seen them throughout the entire season essentially utilize 2 running backs, especially when Austin Eckler was healthy. So you need a desperation play, a play with some sneaky upside. I think Chris Rodriguez could absolutely be that guy for you here in Week 15. All right, very quickly, let's go through our streaming quarterbacks and tight ends, trying to look at the players who are the most lowly rostered at those positions. Let's start with Aiden O'Connell, who may or may not play on Monday, as we all know, and he didn't practice Thursday, so that's a little bit concerning. But if he ends up being the guy, he is dropped to 8% roster, and he's playing the Atlanta Falcons, who just got absolutely sliced and diced left and right by Sam Darnold, which is not a knock on Darnold or anything. He's been playing fantastic this season, but this defense very bad, giving up the 27th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Really the only thing that they're good against is the run. So if O'Connell is out there, you need a last-second desperation play. He is certainly one of those guys. Then we got famous Jameis Winston, right? He is sitting at 41% rostered, had 17.2 fantasy points this past week against Pittsburgh, 24-41, 212 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, 28 yards on the ground. He gets the Chiefs, who are giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and this is a home game for the Browns. I really need to explain this one. Jameis Winston's the king of streaming quarterbacks. Very volatile, but he does have that nice upside. Then we got Cooper Rush. If you're just looking for a floor, you're absolutely desperate, double quarterback, super flex, that kind of thing. He's 11% rostered. He gets Carolina, giving up the 26th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. He has 2 or more passing touchdowns in 2 of his last 4 starts. He hasn't been throwing for a lot of passing yards in his last 2 games, which has affected his total stat lines. But he hasn't been that bad the last 2 games either. And those first 2 starts we saw out of Cooper Rush, he had 17 or more fantasy points. In the last 2 games, like against the Giants, he just didn't really need to throw. Then in Week 14 was kind of weird. He did need to throw. He did throw 2 touchdowns, but only 183 passing yards. So he could bounce back. This Panthers defense has been better as of late, but like I said, still giving up a lot of fantasy points to the quarterback position. Then we got Bryce Young himself, who we had as a streaming option in Week 13, had 23 fantasy points. Did not like him this past week against the Eagles, but he was still pretty dang good by Bryce Young standards against the Eagles. 19-34, 191 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a pick, 29 yards on the ground, and he gets Dallas, Cooper Rush's team, who are giving up the 29th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. He sits at 14% rostered. If you are absolutely desperate for a quarterback this week, especially Superflex double quarterback leagues, he is an option due to the matchup. Then we got Zach Ertz, who I don't really consider a streaming tight end. He sits at 62% rostered, but he was on bye week in Week 14, so there's still a chance he got dropped in your respective league. If he's out there and available, if you're able to pick him up already, he's a great start this week. It's a little bit of a tough matchup against the Saints, giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, but he's had 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games, 12.5 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. He's a startable tight end, really, regardless of the matchup, and I put him on here because he was on bye week this past week. Then we got the Cowboys tight ends, whether you're going with Ferguson or Schoonmaker. It's kind of like a committee tight end room here because Cooper Rush loves Luke Schoonmaker, but Schoonmaker did only have 2 targets, 2 catches this past week. Ferguson got bumped up to 6 targets, 3 catches, 6.2 fantasy points. They're playing the Panthers. The Panthers have not defended like any tight ends this year, giving up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So I would lean with Ferguson. He's higher rostered at 71% rostered, but he's certainly a good option. Then we got Hunter Henry, another player who was on bye week this past week. Tough matchup against Arizona, but he's kind of been a top the tier streaming tight ends for me all season long. Since Drake May has been quarterback, 9.5 or more fantasy points in every game except for one, which was a tough matchup against the Bears, for Hunter Henry, and double digits in every start for Henry with Drake May, except for 3. So Henry, safe floor, not a lot of upside, and 51% rostered, was on bye week this past week. Then we got Pat Freiermuth, who has a tough matchup against Philly. He sits at 56% rostered, but George Pickens is hurt, and I'm very worried if I'm a George Pickens owner right now. But nonetheless, Mike Williams, Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson, I just don't know if this wide receiver room is going to be able to do it for Russell Wilson and company, so we should see some sort of increased volume to Freiermuth, whether it's just in the red zone, whether it's overall. He has 3 touchdowns in his last 5 games, double digits in 3 of his last 5 performances. This is probably going to be a game where the Steelers are forced to throw the football a bit, so Freiermuth is still on the streaming radar moving into Week 15. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 sneaky starts moving into Week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season, and your best streaming options at quarterback and tight end as well. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I can. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 15, be sure to drop me a comment. I will get back to you guys as soon as I can. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have every single thing that you guys could possibly need to help you guys dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. So be sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.